April 1775. The chill of early spring still lingers in the Massachusetts air, but beneath it burns a heat that no season can contain. For years, tensions have been rising between the American colonists and the British Crown. Protests, boycotts, and midnight meetings have turned into open defiance. British troops patrol Boston's streets, their red coats a daily reminder of authority and oppression. To the colonists, these soldiers are not protectors, but occupiers. And in taverns, meeting halls, and churchyards, whispers grow louder. Whispers of liberty, of resistance, of war. The spark has not yet been struck, but everyone feels it is coming. Across the Massachusetts countryside, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers form militias. They drill with muskets and wooden pikes, preparing for a fight they hope never comes. Yet their enemy, the most powerful empire on earth, sees them as rebels, dangerous men conspiring against the king. On the night of April 18, 1775, British General Thomas Gage issues secret orders. Seize the colonial stockpile of weapons hidden in Concord, and arrest the patriot leaders who fuel rebellion. A force of nearly 700 redcoats begins its march under the cover of darkness, unaware that their movements are already being watched. Before the sun rises, riders will thunder across dirt roads. Bells will ring in sleepy villages. Muskets will be loaded by trembling hands. And in a quiet green field in Lexington, a single shot, whether by accident or intention, will shatter the silence. It will be remembered forever as the shot heard round the world. The moment when the American Revolution truly began. The American Revolution did not begin in an instant. It was not born from a single act, but from years of mounting tension between colonists and crown. To understand why blood was first shed in Massachusetts, we must look back at the decades that sowed rebellion. The colonies had grown used to a certain independence. For more than a century, they had managed their own assemblies, taxed themselves, and built lives in the New World with little interference from London. But the end of the French and Indian War in 1763 changed everything. Britain, victorious yet drowning in debt, turned to its colonies to help shoulder the financial burden. Parliament imposed taxes that struck at the heart of colonial life. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 placed duties on everyday goods, from sugar and paper to legal documents and newspapers. For colonists, these were not just financial burdens. They were symbols of power forced upon them without consent. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed from town halls to taverns. When protests boiled over, Britain responded with troops. Boston became a garrisoned city, its cobbled streets patrolled by redcoats. Tensions flared, leading to violent clashes such as the Boston Massacre in 1770, where 5 colonists fell to British muskets. Though small in number, their deaths reverberated like thunder, fueling anger across the colonies. In response to the Tea Act of 1773, patriots staged the Boston Tea Party, dumping chests of British tea into the harbour in defiance. London's retaliation was swift and punishing the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. These closed Boston's port, stripped away self-government, and further tightened Britain's grip. By 1774, resistance was no longer the work of radicals alone. Farmers, merchants, and ministers alike saw tyranny in the Crown's hand. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, uniting colonies in purpose if not yet in arms. Militia companies, calling themselves Minutemen, began stockpiling arms and powder in secret depots across New England. In this fertile ground of resentment and resistance, rebellion took root. The stage was set, and when the British chose to march on Concord in the spring of 1775, they would find not frightened subjects, but armed citizens ready to defend their liberty. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the harvest would be war. Spring of 1775 found Massachusetts in a state of uneasy calm, but beneath the surface, both sides braced for confrontation. In Boston, General Thomas Gage, the British commander, faced a city seething with resentment. His orders from London were clear: suppress the growing rebellion before it spread further. Yet Gage also knew the colonists were armed and restless. Rumors had reached his ears of a large supply of gunpowder and weapons hidden in Concord, a small town 20 miles northwest of Boston. If these supplies remained in rebel hands, they would fuel resistance. Destroying them could cripple the movement before it grew into full-scale war. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage gave his orders. A column of about 700 British regulars, under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn, would march under cover of darkness to seize the weapons. The mission was meant to be swift, silent, and decisive. But secrecy in occupied Boston was impossible. Patriot spies and informants kept constant watch, and Gage's plans quickly leaked. As the soldiers prepared to leave, riders slipped out into the night. Among them was Paul Revere, joined by William Dawes and later Samuel Prescott. Galloping through the countryside, they spread the alarm: the regulars are coming out. Though simplified in later legend to "the British are coming," their message was clear: an armed march was underway. The countryside lit up with warnings. Church bells tolled, drums beat. Minutemen grabbed muskets from mantles and powder from cupboards. What Gage had hoped would be a quiet raid turned into a call to arms that echoed across Middlesex County. Meanwhile, the British regulars trudged out of Boston. Their scarlet coats and gleaming bayonets marked them as the most feared army in the world. Yet this night march was no triumphal parade. The men carried heavy packs, and the road to Concord was long and muddy. Worse still, whispers followed them through the darkness. The colonists knew they were coming. By the time dawn began to creep over the Massachusetts countryside, the redcoats had reached the outskirts of Lexington. There, on the village green, armed colonists waited. The British march had not gone unnoticed, and now the two sides stood on the brink. The long-simmering conflict between empire and colony was about to explode into open war. The morning of April 19, 1775, broke cool and clear over the small village of Lexington. As the sun began to rise, a column of weary British soldiers approached the green, their boots thudding against the packed dirt road. Ahead of them stretched a cluster of homes, a simple meeting house, and an open patch of grass that would soon be etched into history. Waiting there were about 77 colonial militiamen, hastily assembled under the command of Captain John Parker, a farmer and veteran of earlier wars. These men were not professional soldiers. They were blacksmiths, coopers, shopkeepers, and farmers. Many had risen from their beds in the dark hours after Paul Revere's midnight warning. Some were old and grey. Others barely past boyhood. Their muskets were a patchwork of inherited weapons, some polished and others worn from years of use. Parker's orders to his men were firm but restrained. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. His words captured the impossible tension of the moment: resistance without provocation, courage without recklessness. As the redcoats drew near, Major John Pitcairn ordered the militia to disperse. The British had no interest in a pitched battle here. Their goal was Concord. But the colonists did not move quickly enough. They stood uncertain, some backing away, others frozen in place, the air between the two sides thick with fear. Then it happened, an explosion of history contained in a single sound. A shot cracked the morning air. No one knew who fired it, whether a nervous militiaman, a British soldier, or even a misfire from a distant onlooker. But in that instant, restraint shattered. The British regulars unleashed a volley. Muskets flared, smoke filled the green, and men fell. 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more wounded. The survivors fled across fields and behind stone walls as the redcoats surged forward, bayonets flashing. When the smoke cleared, the village green was littered with bodies and stained with blood. The British reformed ranks and resumed their march toward Concord, leaving Lexington scarred but unbroken. For the colonists, the meaning was clear. The first blood of rebellion had been spilled. The road to independence, once only whispered in taverns and town halls, was now paved in sacrifice. The American Revolution had begun. After the smoke cleared at Lexington, the British column, nearly 700 strong under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, resumed its march. Their mission, as ordered by General Thomas Gage, was to move quickly, seize hidden stores of colonial weapons in Concord, and return before the countryside fully erupted in resistance. But speed was no longer on their side. The alarm system, carefully built by colonial patriots, was already in motion. Riders fanned out across the countryside. Church bells clanged and drums beat through villages. From every farm and hamlet, militiamen were rising, grabbing muskets, powder horns, and whatever provisions they could carry. The countryside was alive with the rhythm of rebellion. The British regulars trudged along the dusty road. They were tired. Many had marched through the night. The sun now rose higher, warming the spring air, and sweat trickled beneath their red coats. Yet discipline held. The column stretched for half a mile. Grenadiers in front, light infantry along the flanks, officers on horseback issuing sharp commands. But as they pressed on, the unseen enemy grew closer. From behind stone fences, barns, and trees, farmers watched their every step. Though most of these men did not yet fire, their very presence was unnerving. The countryside had transformed into hostile ground. At Monotony and other small villages, colonists began to harass the marchers, shadowing their path. Every mile brought the British deeper into a tightening web of resistance. The regulars could sense it, the silence of fields broken only by birdsong and distant bells, the occasional glint of musket barrels in the brush, the unsettling knowledge that the countryside was awake. By the time they reached the outskirts of Concord, it was clear that their mission would not be simple. The element of surprise, so vital to success, had evaporated. Instead of finding a sleepy town and hidden caches ready for the taking, the British were walking into a community braced for their arrival. Colonial militia companies from surrounding towns, Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and Sudbury, were converging on Concord in disciplined groups. Some marched barefoot, others in worn boots, but all carried determination in their hearts. The British had set out to confiscate weapons. Instead, they were about to ignite the second spark of revolution. The road to Concord was no longer just a march. It was a descent into the crucible of history. By mid-morning on April 19, 1775, the British column entered Concord. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith divided his forces, sending some into the town to search for supplies, while others were dispatched to guard key roads and bridges. At first, it seemed the mission might proceed without major bloodshed. But the colonists had not been idle. Militia companies from nearby towns were streaming into Concord, swelling their numbers to nearly 400 men. They assembled on a hill overlooking the town, watching as smoke began to rise from Concord's center. Whether the smoke came from burning supplies or a structure set aflame by British soldiers remains debated, but to the colonists, it was a spark that ignited fear and anger. Colonel James Barrett, who commanded the local militia, gave the order to advance toward the North Bridge, where about 90 British soldiers stood guard. The militia descended the slope in a long line, drums beating, fifes piping, banners carried aloft. This was no longer a loose band of farmers, it was an army taking shape. As they approached, tension crackled in the air. The British soldiers at the bridge, outnumbered, watched nervously as the colonists closed in. For a brief moment, silence ruled, broken only by the rushing waters of the Concord River beneath the bridge. Then a shot rang out. No one knows from which side it came, but it triggered chaos. The British fired a volley. 2 colonists fell and several more were wounded. But unlike at Lexington, the militia did not scatter. Instead, Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, who had declared earlier, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go," led his company forward. He was struck and killed, but his men pressed on. The colonists returned fire with deadly accuracy. The British line wavered, then broke. Soldiers fell back across the bridge in confusion, leaving the ground littered with the wounded. For the first time in the conflict, organized colonial forces had stood their ground, exchanged volleys, and forced British regulars into retreat. It was a moment of profound symbolism. Concord's North Bridge became the place where resistance transformed into revolution, where ordinary men proved that they could face the Empire's finest troops and prevail. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call it the shot heard round the world. The clash at Concord's North Bridge had shattered the illusion of a quick, bloodless British mission. The regulars, shocked by the ferocity of the militia's response, began regrouping. But by now, the Massachusetts countryside was fully awake. Alarm riders had spread the news far and wide, and every road leading back to Boston seemed to fill with armed colonists determined to strike. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith ordered his men to begin the long march back east toward Lexington, and then Boston. The retreating British columns stretched for miles, weighed down by fatigue, hunger, and dwindling supplies. They had already marched through the night from Boston to Lexington, then fought at both Lexington and Concord. Now they faced a punishing return journey, one made infinitely worse by the fact that they were no longer in control of the battlefield. From behind stone walls, barns, orchards, and fences, colonial militia fired into the British ranks. These were not formal volleys but sharp, stinging shots from farmers and shopkeepers who knew the terrain better than any map. The British were trained to fight in open fields, where disciplined lines could deliver crushing volleys. But in the twisting, narrow roads of rural Massachusetts, those same formations became easy targets. At every bend in the road, another ambush awaited. In places like Miriam's Corner and along the Bloody Angle near Lincoln, the British suffered devastating casualties. Men fell in the road, and their comrades struggled to keep ranks under constant fire. The scarlet of their coats made them painfully visible against the spring landscape, while the colonists melted away like ghosts after each volley. By the time the weary redcoats staggered back into Lexington, their situation was desperate. Colonel Smith himself was wounded, and his men were on the verge of collapse. But at Lexington, salvation arrived in the form of reinforcements, nearly 1,000 fresh troops under Lord Hugh Percy. With artillery and more disciplined ranks, Percy's men formed a protective square, allowing Smith's battered column to rest and regroup. Even so, the respite was short-lived. Once the march resumed, the relentless pattern of ambushes began again. The colonists grew bolder as their numbers swelled, striking from hillsides and forests, then vanishing before British bayonets could reach them. What began as a small expedition to seize weapons had turned into a running gauntlet of survival. The retreat became a test of endurance as much as courage. By the time the British finally reached the safety of Charlestown, under the guns of their navy, they had marched nearly 20 miles under fire. Their losses were staggering: 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists suffered fewer but still significant casualties: 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. But beyond the numbers, the retreat to Boston carried a deeper meaning. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered. Ordinary colonists had not only resisted but had forced the king's soldiers into retreat. The events of April 19, 1775, showed that the American Revolution had truly begun not with words and a pamphlet, but with musket fire echoing along the roads of Massachusetts. As dusk settled over Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, the roads between Concord and Boston lay littered with broken muskets, torn haversacks, and the bodies of men who had marched out that morning with very different expectations. For the British, it had been a humiliating lesson. The countryside they thought docile was instead alive with armed resistance, and the march they expected to control had turned into a gauntlet of ambushes and blood. For the colonists, the day was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had stood their ground against the most powerful army in the world, proving that liberty was worth the risk of death. Yet the cost was steep. Dozens of farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen lay dead. Families grieved, communities mourned, but there was no turning back. Once the first shots were fired, reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. The world soon heard what had happened. News of the battles at Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire across the colonies and across the Atlantic. To the Americans, it became a rallying cry, a story of ordinary men rising against tyranny. To the British, it was a warning. This was not a minor rebellion to be stamped out easily, but the beginning of something much larger. From that day forward, the shot heard round the world echoed in every council, every tavern, and every battlefield that followed. Within weeks, militias from across New England poured into Boston, surrounding the city in what became the Siege of Boston. The revolution was no longer an idea whispered in pamphlets. It was a war now being fought in fields, roads, and homes. Lexington and Concord were not the largest battles of the American Revolution, nor were they the bloodiest, but they were the spark, the ignition point of a struggle that would transform 13 colonies into a new nation. Out of the smoke and confusion of that April day came a clear truth. The fight for independence had begun. History would never look back the same way.